Hi there, my name is Dr. Rachel Callan Whitman, and I am very excited to be able to virtually reach out to you guys today and talk about a very important topic. And I'm very excited to be able to support my former classmate and colleague, Dr. McHugh, who went through the EDD program with myself and are excited now to have teaching opportunities to both share what we know and learn from other people like yourselves. So I wanted to talk about diversity and disability because let's face it, we live in a world of work where a lot of our identity is derived from what we do for a living, what we do every day. Sometimes it's something that gives us passion, sometimes not so much. But either way, work has become a core integral element of how we understand ourselves and how we fit in the world. And this comes also from not just in terms of making money, which is important, need those resources, but also again on how we can navigate our communities in some regards easier depending on the resources we have, or having a more difficult time, which can be a cause of lack of resources or being part of a marginalized group, like having a disability. Personal information about myself. So I completed my dissertation and related research on disability narratives and having a better understanding of how young professionals who have disabilities manage to achieve various levels of success. And this was a personally meaningful field of study for myself, as I also live with a disability. So personally and professionally, I like to engage with different audiences about this type of topic because, again, it's very near and dear to my heart. What I wanted to go through again is the fact that, as you all know, as career counselors, it's really important to educate people comprehensively. And this, in part, is the consumer or the client in your office, but also perhaps trying to work with different agencies and organizations to make sure that they, on their end, are equipped both in terms of having the logistical information, having the resources, but also attitudinally being ready to support and embrace diversity. Something that I wanted to mention, however, is that NPR conducted a few research studies in 2010 looking at how do we define diversity in America. And they found that the majority of medium and large US companies have a really hard time defining diversity. They talk about how important diversity is. There is an emphasis there. Certain words are dropped, especially when it comes to ethnicity, race, sexuality. However, when it came to things like ability or disability, the definition was definitely lacking. In fact, according to a 2007 survey by the Society for Human Resource Management, only 30% of human resource professionals say that their company has an official definition of diversity. And not a lot has changed since then. So let's say we all agree, I'm not in this room, but I'm pretty sure everybody in this room would agree that diversity is important. And it's important for a lot of different reasons. Starters, we learn from each other. If people come in from different backgrounds, different perspectives, different life experiences, they hail from different communities, we can enrich our own understanding of the world through other people's eyes. If we all have the same upbringing, the same background, the same formative experiences, we'll probably see things the same way. And so diversity allows us to open up our options and open up our eyes. It allows us to have more creative solutions to different problems, especially problems that are varying and growing, reflecting the fact that we have a very diverse culture. Diversity is really important, but you have to be responsible with your diversity, which I think you guys probably have had some discussion about. And it's this idea that you want to support someone with a disability, you want to support a diverse category of individuals. However, you really can't tokenize them. And what that means is you need to educate yourselves on the background, on terminology, on how to best support people of diverse backgrounds. So then when you can, it's up to that time when you can respectfully facilitate and collaborate and cooperate, all of the parties are well linked, well synced together. And so it's not about tokenization. It's not about misunderstanding diversity or trying to pigeonhole it. It's about authentic and comprehensive learning. And diversity is really important because it helps us dispel negative stereotypes and our own personal biases that we have about groups that seem different to us. And as career counselors, you're going to have individuals from all walks of life enter your practice, walk through your door, and being able to support them in a way that they need, not just in a way that you think they might need, is really, really critical. The Queensborough Community College of the CUNYs has this really great list of the 7 essential actions in order to embrace and support multiculturalism. A little bit of a mouthful, but I think these are really important, and so they're worth repeating. In order to embrace and support multiculturalism, it requires recognition of the abundant diversity of cultures, respect for the differences, acknowledging the validity of different cultural expressions and contributions, valuing what other cultures offer, encouraging the contribution of diverse groups, empowering people to strengthen themselves and others to achieve their maximum potential by being critical of their own biases, and lastly, celebrating rather than just tolerating the differences in order to bring about unity through diversity. And with my own classes that I teach in the psychology department at Duquesne University about the inherent need for us to not just accept, but to integrate individuals from all cultural backgrounds, it bears repeating that this is something that is an active process that everyone must engage in. Everyone must plug in and play their part. I'm not sure how many other courses you've had at this point that talk about disability and talk about diversity and thus the need. And there's the theoretical talking about how important it is, and then there's the application of embracing, accepting, welcoming diversity into, for example, a workplace. And as somebody who does their research on disability integration, disability and opportunity in a variety of settings, both in education and in employment, it's important for me to share that while businesses currently are incorporating this idea of diversity, which again isn't defined incredibly well, they're not necessarily doing it in a functional way. In fact, the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission reported a record number of discrimination charge filings in fiscal 2008, some 95,000 nationwide, which marked a 15% increase over the previous year, as cited in an article from NPR in 2010 called Diversity Efforts Uneven in U.S. So there's a problem. We don't talk about diversity, but more importantly, as indicative by the fact that there are so many discrimination charges filed by people who have disabilities themselves, is that we're not talking about disability. We're not meeting in the middle and trying to learn from each other. We're having shallow conversations or no conversations at all. In the same article from NPR in 2010, a professor of organizational behavior at Harvard Business School, Robert Eli, accounted that talking about diversity, talking about disability is still a taboo subject. People are afraid to talk about it because they don't want to offend others. So there's a really big problem if people are not talking about disability, if people are not talking about it from the lens of perhaps the professional who's doing the hiring, from the individual who has the disability. And this is where you come in. You need this language as well. You need to be able to engage someone with a disability and provide them counseling that really does efficiently and effectively meet their needs. Again, so I have a disability, and part of having a disability means finding the right way to communicate what your needs are. And I'm going to go to my personal story about my own experience, because for me, as somebody who, this is my background educationally, this is something that I have been studying for many, many years. I have the language, I have the confidence, I have the resources to say, hey, I live with this disability, and these are the accommodations that I need, which is something that most people do not have. My story, I live with an invisible disability, and when I have been in experiences where I can disclose or not disclose my disability, it can become an incredibly stressful experience, as I'm sure you might imagine, because the reality is no one has to disclose that they have a disability. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, in order to receive accommodations, someone has to disclose their disability, which means they have to, at any point, because the reality is there's no initial, they have to disclose during the interview, at the job offer, first couple weeks in the job. There are no guidelines there. Something that's a common theme that we're going to talk about is the vagueness of looking at disability. It's vague when we talk about diversity, and it's also vague in legislation too, which could be problematic, I'm sure, as you can understand. So on my front, when I was trying to make the decision whether or not to disclose, I knew my rights. I knew what I had to say and also what I didn't have to say, who I could tell and who I didn't have to tell. And for me, when I was working at a previous job as a disability services coordinator, I disclosed that I had a disability during my interview, because for me, the comfort level I had with my disability and the accommodations I need was pretty much solidified. So moving forward, I knew that, I was qualified for the job and the accommodations that I needed were feasible in line with the nature of the position. Accommodations are critical for many people with disabilities. They are not a handout. They are not an unfair advantage. Accommodations are about leveling the playing field. It's about providing equity. Because if we think about it, equality is guaranteeing everybody has the same shot. But in a society where we have institutionally racist and ableist and sexist systems, equality is not really realistic. But equity is where we need to put our energy, providing equity and equitable opportunities. So for example, due to the nature of my invisible disability, which involves some concentration related issues, being able to have an office where I could close my door was essential. If I needed to get through a long report, if I needed to do paperwork really of any kind, I needed to have the flexibility to kind of buffer myself from the sound of the office. And in doing so, I got the work done, and I got the work done in a way that I maximized my own potential. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, you cannot require, if you need an accommodation that is pretty much at odds with the essential characteristics of the job, then that accommodation is not considered to be reasonable or appropriate, is the terminology. So how do you decide this? Well, again, vague is the word of the day, because it can be something that can be very difficult for the employer and the individual to tease out. A good example, however, is if an individual who has a disability struggles to lift, for example, 15 pounds, but the job they're applying for, a fundamental essential characteristic of the job is that they be able to lift 20 pounds, then they're not going to be eligible for the job. They're not considered qualified. However, I, have worked with lots of individuals with disabilities who have jobs because they have found a reasonable accommodation. So, for example, I work with consumers and clients who have vision issues. They have low vision, they're blind, and for them, being able to hold a job in, for say, an office that involves computer skills is actually doable if they have a screen reader. So for them, being able to disclose the need for a screen reader that enables them to do the job is something that is fitting, is doable. It's not considered to be an undue financial burden on the institution or on the employer. I know I'm getting a little bit into the nitty-gritties of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but this idea of something being an undue financial burden is the language that basically says that a company would not have to provide a certain accommodation if it would cost the employing agency, or for example, any institution that is being asked to accommodate by an individual, it would cause them undue burden based on the cost. This is very rare, because in a lot of situations, to be honest, most accommodations are really cheap. In fact, most accommodations have zero cost at all affiliated with them, and for others, it's a marginal cost that can easily be paid by the employer. So I tell you kind of all of this background about accommodations and the employer's responsibility because it's important to know that if you work with clients who have disabilities, this might be some of the language that they experience, that they see in when they're looking for a position, when they're looking for maybe even writing their cover letter and asking you, do I disclose here? Because what's really important is the individual has to make that decision. They, again, don't have to disclose. However, if an individual gets fired, for example, because they were unable to do a task and they later disclose they have a disability and having an accommodation would have ameliorated that situation, they're at a loss because unless the disability is disclosed, nobody knows about it, which does make quite a bit of sense. But it's a very sensitive and vulnerable thing for individuals with disabilities to disclose that they have a disability. In particular, this happens for individuals with invisible disabilities, kind of like myself, where if I do not disclose, it's not immediately obvious. When you work with individuals with disabilities who are interested in finding a job, they want to find a career, a position that works for them, if it's a temporary thing, long-term, exploring their options, you name it. Being able to provide them with the language to practice disclosing can be incredibly important. Learning how to say, this is the disability that I have, these are the needs that I have, and help them suggest accommodations that would enable them to do the job. Hiring managers at different agencies, it's not really their job necessarily to have accommodations up their sleeve. And while a lot of human resources offices can provide that support, an individual who chooses to disclose their disability, who then can also say the accommodations that would best support them in achieving their employment goals, they've got a really significant leg up. They're able to communicate their needs, creatively problem solve, and in a way, they're starting the job off on the right foot of basically saying, look, I know how to solve this problem. I know how to communicate my needs. Let's move forward. So I think that's something that's really important, yet not necessarily a guarantee. Disclosing your disability can be incredibly challenging and vulnerable. And like we said, as a culture, we're really not great when it comes to talking about disability, about finding the right language. So for career counselors, being able to support individuals with disabilities by giving them a safe space to practice disclosing, to practice figuring out what they feel comfortable sharing and what they don't feel comfortable sharing can make such a huge difference. Ultimately, individuals with disabilities own their narratives. They make the calls, they make the decisions. So being able to rehearse these narratives in a way that is empowering and promotes agency can make a really big difference when something like employment is on the line. That is incredibly meaningful in a world where we kind of are our work. So I think that's something that's important when we look at working with marginalized groups, and just individuals with disabilities are no exception. So I always think this is easy. I do a lot of work. My concentration in my doctoral program was disability studies. So this is my world, but it's not everybody else's. And so a lot of times when I have this conversation with people, I'm met with a lot of kind of confused faces and kind of wide eyes, because this information is not really readily available for most of us. This is a fact. Disability is the largest minority group, not just in the United States, but in the world. It is the largest disability is the largest, minority group in the entire world. And that's because disability is not a static condition. You are not just either born with a disability or not born with a disability, and that's the status quo. For many people, disability is something that is acquired as they proceed through their life. It could be acquired in terms of a car accident, a mental illness. The reality is disability can happen at any point in our existence because it's part of the human condition. Something that is important to note is that, piggybacking on this idea, is that we're all temporarily able-bodied. The term TAB is often used in the field of disability studies because we're all going to become disabled. We're all going to have disabilities at some point of time. So you kind of might say, well, I don't have a disability. How does that apply to myself? Well, we live in a world where we have a system built for certain people. Our world is built for neurotypical people. It is built for people who are able-bodied. This is a little bit of a simplistic example, but look around you. We have stairs everywhere. As you get older and you no longer are able to use your limbs, or you have more aggravated struggles and eventually you can't use stairs, by definition, you now have a disability because you cannot access what the majority, or what we consider to be the majority of people, are able to access. And this is why this is a matter of social justice and there are ethical implications, because ultimately we all have the right, whether we are able-bodied, if we are or if we have disabilities, whether we are Caucasian, African American, women, men, if we are non-binary gender, we all have the right to have equal access. In some situations, this requires accommodations, like we talked about. But in situations where there are large-scale examples of inaccessibility, the fact that we don't address those is highly, highly problematic. And this comes back and talks about, and something that's very interesting to me, is this idea of the social model of disability. And the social model of disability maintains that the issue with disability is the limitations that are imposed by society, by the physical landscape that we've built, by the programmatic landscape, by attitudinal barriers we've seeded since we were very young, and create more cultural biases that are widely adopted, stereotypes and stigma, etc. And the problem is we don't address them. So what do I mean by that? And again, this is a little bit of a simplistic definition, but if we took all of those staircases that I mentioned earlier and we replaced them with ramps, how would the definition of disability change? More people would have access. Would they be considered disabled? Probably not. So it's important that we think about this because, again, we will all be rendered disabled throughout at some point during our lives, and yet we're not really actively working to mediate and modify the world that we live in, because for us, we kind of look at being able-bodied and being neurotypical as the status quo guarantee, which it is not. And so I think that's something that's really important too to look at, is that disability impacts pretty much all of us. I talked to you about how it impacts me as someone with an invisible disability. I live with it personally. It's part of my everyday life. And when I work with clients and consumers who have disabilities, their relationship is really unique. It's very personal. Disability is a personal thing. There's a disability culture because this is a community where people from across the spectrum share common challenges in language. But it is important to recognize the fact that we need to work with the individual. This is an important part that I think is left out of a lot of programs, that when you work with an individual with a disability, it's really important to find the terminology that they prefer, which means are they person first? An example of person first language is to say, Jackie has bipolar. Jackie is not the disability. Jackie has a mental illness. That might be the preferred way Jackie communicates her disability. But there are some individuals who use identity first behavior. For example, Brian is autistic. In Brian's situation, being autistic is part of his identity. It is part of who he is. So he chooses to use that terminology. What's really important when we work with individuals with disabilities, and this really applies to any marginalized group, we listen. We hear what we hear what they want. We understand their needs. We ask questions respectfully and try to provide the most comprehensive supports that we can. We want to use the language that they use. We want to learn from them so we can really create a more cohesive relationship that can really breed to making more positive outcomes, like actually getting a job or someone feeling more secure, if you know how to work with that person and if you know how to speak their language. That's really, really important. I think another thing that is important is, we want to learn language. We want to understand how the person identifies, how they articulate their needs. But I think something that is really important to mention is the fact that intersectionality is huge. Intersectionality is a really, really, really significant factor in a lot of people's lives. Intersectionality really applies to the fact that not all individuals either have one marginalized identity or are dominant culture. A lot of places, and a lot of individuals rather, they exist in the intersections. So what does this mean? I have a friend who is African American, and he also uses a wheelchair. He is a wheelchair user. And for him, being Black and having to use a wheelchair for mobility gives him a very, very different experience than a white wheelchair user or a individual or a person of color who doesn't have a disability. So being cognizant of the fact that intersectionality plays such a huge role for so many people is really important, because without having that knowledge and without having that respect for that information and providing a safe space to talk about it, you're really missing out on the experience of the individual. My friend who is a person of color who has a mobility impairment, when he goes to a job, he's not just advocating as someone who's qualified, but also as someone who's Black and as someone who uses a wheelchair. He's up against some pretty serious stereotypes. He's got to challenge some stigma. So the resources and energy it takes for him is different than it would take for someone like myself, a white woman who has an invisible disability. So being able to understand the varied experience that people have and being able to provide a safe space to discuss and unpack those different experiences, because a lot of this really does factor into how we understand disclosure and the challenges that come with disclosing one has a disability. That's integral to being able to create a relationship with your client that can translate into a potential job where they're going to do well and they'll know how to ask for help and what resources are available to them. So I talked a little bit about my relationship with disability, but I think it's important to understand what your personal relationship with disability is. So as we have discussed, I have an invisible disability that I was born with. That is something that I have learned how to understand for my own life. But we all have a relationship with disability, whether it is because we have a sibling, a spouse, a child, a grandparent, the fact that we know that in 15 years, we're going to need certain aids to help us get around. That will basically mean we're quote unquote disabled because we can't access everyday society. We all have to dig in and understand how disability impacts us personally, because the reality is it does. Disability impacts all of us. So I'm not saying that when you meet with your students or your clients rather, I'm not saying that you disclose your own disability. I'm just saying it's important to have a good understanding of how this is a universal issue. I'm saying that you should be in that office presenting yourself as an ally. Career counselors, in my opinion, are allies. Allies who can best support an individual who has a particular need, who can provide resources, who can provide a safe space for them to process and unpack what they're going through. A space where they can rehearse things like disclosing, going through an interview. These types of issues that basically anyone you work with might kind of experience when they come to applying for a job or figuring out what job they are looking for. As an ally, I think it's important that you ask yourself these questions. How can I accurately and authentically talk about or explain a problem that does not impact me directly? And the reality, that means, well, you can't. An ally is somebody who has to ask, who has to learn, who has to take the opportunity to find that client in their office who's going through an experience that you might know nothing about, but benefit from that diversity by learning from them in a way that is respectful, in a way that says, I am here to support you as comprehensively as I can and create a space where when you need help, I will provide it for you. Because the reality is, I think when it comes to disability and when it comes to allyship, it really means redefining ability. And for career counselors, that means challenging their own bias, challenging how they think about disability, and making that conscientious decision to realize that disability does not mean inability. Disability does not mean passivity. Disability does not mean docile. Individuals with disabilities can be highly successful employees and business owners, staff members, supervisors, managers, you name it. But a lot of times they aren't given the right opportunities. And there's a lot of stigma surrounding disability that can get in the way, which is why having an ally who can use their privilege and their power to raise that voice and to support that person, that can make a huge informative difference. Because here's the thing, and I really hate ending on a little bit of a negative note, but I think it's really important that as career counselors, you're fully aware that individuals with disabilities have the highest rates of unemployment and underemployment of any minority group. And this, as we discussed, disability is the largest minority group in the world. And this doesn't just stop at the lack of employment or underemployment, but this also translates to individuals with disabilities having limited access to comprehensive medical care. Individuals with disabilities are also more likely to be sexually assaulted and abused than other marginalized groups. And students with disabilities are significantly less likely to have an equitable education compared to their non-disabled peers. Individuals with disabilities have restricted access to public transportation and restricted entry into public buildings. We've talked about stairs. Affordable and accessible housing is really hard to come by in most parts of the county, in most part of the country rather. And this is a really, really big problem. And I'll provide I'll provide the citations for all of these with Professor McHugh. But the reality is, the more individuals with disabilities that we can support and empower to achieve their employment goals, we're going to start changing the stereotypes and negative misconceptions about disability. We're going to take disability and make it just a detail, not something that distinguishes someone in a negative way, but might be an indicator that they do things differently. And so I think a really important part of being in the human services field as an educator as myself or a counselor as yourselves is being able to challenge the biases that you have, what you think about disability, what you think about inability, what you think about ability, and really make sure you go through the motions of digging deep to challenge these preconceived notions that you might have, which could impact how you work with a client or a consumer. A lot of disability oppression or ableism is pretty subtle. Unfortunately, it's something that we might not always see, we might not always recognize, especially if we are neurotypical or able-bodied. And so when we start opening our eyes and our hearts and listening and trying to understand the experience of people with disabilities and the fact that what they go through, the barriers, the hurdles they must go over both physically and attitudinally, we start seeing the fact that there needs to be support for these individuals because there may be more problems than we thought. I worked at a college where I spoke a little briefly of. I worked at a college and I was a disability service coordinator. I worked with young people who would be graduating from an institution of higher learning. And it came to my attention my first year on the job that there was the stage where people walked when they received their diploma. It wasn't wheelchair accessible. Here I was at an institution of higher learning that was here to educate people from all walks of life, from people from every background, every demographic. But the stage was inaccessible. If you had a mobility impairment and you were attending this institution, you could not graduate with your peers. And that's always stuck with me as kind of a reminder that we do not always think about what it means to have a disability, the experience of being disabled, how different it can be. And so being an ally, being somebody who listens, who asks some questions and provides answers, but can be there as a source of empowerment for somebody who has a disability, who has a goal, say, getting a certain job, we have to be incredibly cognizant of the privilege that we have, of the social injustice this country has when it comes to ability or inaccessibility, and making sure that when we work with a client, we truly hear, we truly support, we truly engage, we truly learn from them, and we do our homework. We look for supports, we look at resources. I'm going to be providing a little guide of resources to Professor McHugh so you can go out and educate yourself. Looking at different programs that exist, like the workforce recruitment program for the government that supports young students who have college students with disabilities who are looking for employments. The Job Assistance Network, the Job Accommodations Network, also known as JAN, which is a warehouse of information that pretty much provides individuals with disabilities as well as career counselors possible accommodations. You can go in there and look by disability and find accommodations that might be useful, that might be something that garners a support and confidence for someone you're working with. I wish I could have been there in person this evening, but unfortunately I could not. And so I hope you found this to be educational, and I hope you found this to be the part of your journey in expanding how you think about yourself and the world and the clients that you're going to be working with. And how to create an experience where everybody feels safe and comfortable learning. Um, so I'm going to wind up there, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. And again, it was a pleasure, and I hope you took something away from this. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. McHugh.